Hello, and welcome to another exciting episode of Victory Never Sleeps. Um, this last week has flown by. Doesn't seem like it's been a whole week since our last episode. As always, it's great to talk to you guys again tonight. Just thinking we've got this broadcast, and I try to keep up with the numbers. Some of our guys helped us on the back end, but I appreciate everybody who watches this show and participates live, everybody who listens on Spotify. Adding those numbers up and taking a look at it, it really does make it far and wide. So I'm excited at the reach of this program, and it's an audience-driven show. So I appreciate you guys with all your great questions every week. So Nick will post up the dates, but we've got Ostara in the South coming up. Ostara in the South takes place at Thorshoff in Linden, North Carolina. We would love to see all of you guys there. Anybody who's in the area, absolutely. But even if you live a little bit far off, you got a little bit of time to make some arrangements, and we'd love to see you out there. It's a beautiful spot. It's a place that's near and dear to my heart. If you're not a member and you still want to attend or whatever, please make sure you reach out to your local folk builder, and we can try to get you set up so we can make that happen. But I'm looking forward to seeing all my AFA family in Thorshoff down there. I think that's where we're at. Our last episode with Svan on the Gods, I was not able to be here for. We had a stomach bug going through my house. So thankfully, Whit and Brandy stepped in and did a great job, as she always does. But it's good to be back on tonight, and it's good to be back on with my good friend Svan. Hey, Svan, how you doing tonight? Welcome, and thanks for joining us.
Hi, how's it going? Doing well. Rushing in, swooping in at the last minute from work. So
counts.
Yep.
Counts. We were nervous, but it counts.
I'm terribly sorry to cause the nervousness, but yes.
Oh, why? You were on time.
Yes, but it's the nerve. I know the nerves on wire sometimes with me and timing, especially just because of work. I work.
No, you make an impact. You make an impact. If everybody's like waiting on you to show up, then it's like a grand entrance.
Oh.
All right. Well, so. Can you introduce the audience again, and admittedly so, just like Vidar last week, Vali is a less talked about, one of our gods with less material for us to work from, and one of our gods that I think a lot of people listening may be completely unfamiliar with. So could you kind of give folks what they need to know about Lord Vali?
Yes, it's rightfully so that there's a sense of this is one of those moments in which I think the gods really do interact. I think in our sense, we have so little to go on in lore that a lot of the true body of Vali is comes from devotional act. It's kind of beautiful in that way, in the sense that there's a little tiny amount of foundational fragments. He's only mentioned twice or three times, and then also mentioned once by Saxo Grammaticus in his writings. It is also worth noting, though, a huge influential part of the AFA's learning of Vali to also pulls from Hauksbok, which is an interesting manuscript as well. So I think that's worth noting. But, this foundation of lore is very, very scant. And I think that there's also a purposeful sense that Vidar and Vali are oftentimes grouped together. And that's because of the significance of their placement after all things come apart and return back together. But Vali really is in essence, the swift action or the immediacy of karma. And I use, these words because I think people are familiar with them. Or would it even would be like the immediate hinging of dharma. Like it's that because something is so far out of the rightness of natural law, then Vali is the corrector of it in almost an immediate sense. Whereas opposed to last time we were talking about Vidar and the slow culmination of the buildup of what corrective action must be taken. And that oftentimes he's formulated in a disciplined sense. Vali is seen as immediate and not disciplined, but ragefully moving forward and swiftly. So Vali is often seen a furious avenger of immediate correction to dharma, or correction to natural law, correct to right action and cosmic order. That's kind of a that's a bit of a doozy to start.
So, okay, for people that are completely unfamiliar with the story, can you tell folks, what karma or what workings of dharma Vali is enacting? What is he avenging? How does that work? How does he play into that story for folks that are completely unfamiliar?
Well, so it is said that after Balder is slain by the mistletoe that is ultimately thrown by his brother Hoder. Hoder is left in this sense that he's committed a great travesty of killing his brother. But he was also guided by Loki, and Loki is the brother, or the mixed of, they made blood oath or blood brother to Odin. And so in essence, he is a kinslayer as well. And this leaves a very strange place for things to happen. And in a way, he's mentioned that he is born of Rindr, and that he is not but one night old when he slays Balder's adversaries, how it's translated. And this is in reference to Hoder, who isn't actually his adversary, except if you're looking at like the Saxo Grammaticus version. But again, he doesn't slay Balder in Saxo's version, but he is one night old, and he is not even cleaned, nor is his hair cut or combed, and he enacts an immediate slaying upon Hoder to correct the moment. Loki escapes, and then the gods begin to search for Loki, and after mourning the death of Balder and doing the correct funerary rites, or the funerary rites that are described in the Eddas. And I think we're all familiar with that. And then the enactment of judgment upon Loki is then focused on. So Vali has a small mention there, and it's worth noting that the little things that are mentioned there are about time. I think that when we talk about mythic stories, when we think of a god being born but only one night old, and it's it's joked about the idea that he's a baby, or in this case he's a baby, but we're talking about divine beings. It's instantaneous birth. It's instantaneous creation of a being that sole purpose is to immediately rectify that which must be corrected in order to bring balance back, to make right. And that, I think, is so he becomes the fulcrum of the scales, if you will. So he's mentioned there, and then of course there is some confusion about later on when dealing with Loki, and I figured we'd cover that a little later. So I've always seen Vali as more so the god of vengeance in an immediate action, but I think from more a divine sense and less from a personage sense. a sense in which the gods would enact Vali immediately to correct something that was grievously wrong.
Well, before we move on really quick, I see a couple of things in the chat. Buck, I know you're not on for a long time. It's good to see you. I'm glad you stopped in to say hi. He also mentioned about making a donation. If folks want to donate during the program or participate in Super Chat, that's something you do on Entropy, and Nick can pop up the link. And also, looks like Hunter is joining us for his first edition of Victory Never Sleeps. So, hey, Hunter, we're glad you made it. That said, I think though we don't have a ton of material on Vali, I think that the material that we have is very powerful, perhaps powerful in its brevity. And I also think, gross as it may be, I think that the imagery of, him still being covered in the afterbirth, like he doesn't wash, he doesn't do anything. He goes immediately from birth to fulfilling his mission, and there'll be time to, shower and comb his hair later. I think that really speaks to me, the imagery on that.
Yes, and it's based, the presumption, again, it's not mentioned that he's a baby. It's mentioned that he is a god born and that not one night old, and so, the clingings of being created. And it's interesting too who Vali springs from. He springs from the Ausenya Rindr, Rindr, and Rindr is sometimes referred to as a Jotun, and in Saxo Grammaticus, of course, he euhemerizes all of the gods, so she's seen as a princess of the Ruthians, who are in modern day, like Ukraine, Poland, is where they were around at that time. But Rindr is one of the many Ausenir that have aspects of the earth. That she is, her dominion is a threshold of the earth. Our Asatru has many goddesses who are, points of focus in which they take that power that is the earth, the primordial power that is the earth. This very same thing that Odin, Vili, and Ve shaped. There are many goddesses that represent those. That some people have a tendency to kind of cram them all together, and kind of make just a broad sense kind of earth goddess, earth mom. And I think that's very outside of the norm of hard polytheism. And Rindr is representative of the rind, the crust, and in reference linguistically to ice, the rind of ice or the cold. So she's often seen as the goddess that brings about the encapsulation of the earth, the crystalline snow and ice admixture. It's believed that she may have some correlations to the Anglo-Saxon goddess Hretha, who is also honored around this time with an actual month. But that's, up to speculation. But the Rindr is most likely in reference to not the crust of the earth, but like a crust of the ice. So from this kind of cold stasis, this proto-matter that's still is cracked, severed, and out comes Vali in immediacy. So everything about Vali is like it's like a lightning strike or a vengeful arrow from the heavens, if you will.
All right. Well, we're happy to take any questions you guys may have about Vali or about anything else. In the meantime, the picture, and we're using a picture out of the same manuscript to illustrate Forseti as well. Picture's kind of an ugly little picture. I didn't choose it because of that. I did choose it because it was old and it was unique. And Svan, I don't know if you have any background on this particular manuscript, but it's from the mid 1600s, I believe, and it's in somebody's private collection, and it's got kind of the people that handed it down. I think it's in a Swedish collection, but I'm not sure. So I'm not sure if you're familiar or not.
I am a little I'm familiar with it, but like I'm not familiar actually with the item. The item's been speculated about. Most people have assumed that it's a drinking horn that he's carrying, but it just was not drawn with a significant curvature. But again, I mean, I don't know. It's interesting about the imagery in that manuscript. Like you had talked about the imagery of Odin, and that's very interesting with what he's carrying. But I would also like to make point that the interesting thing I found about it was the use of the W, the V, and the dropping of the W. This happened in our language with the H a lot, and with the G becoming more silent but still used. H was oftentimes dropped completely. Excuse me. And the V and W as a letter were interchangeably used, oftentimes with the sound V. So the most people are familiar with like Vodanas or Votan or Vodin or Woden, and that's when that shift starts to happen, where our language begins to overemphasize the double V, as it's called, even in Icelandic. The W is the W, and so in here you see the W is used, but there's no accent over the A, so it's Valle is how that would be read. But a lot of people, again, that's pretty close to the Americanized English version. Most people say Vali. And in the Old Norse, or even in Icelandic now, the Vauli is that dash above the A makes an ow sound. So, and again, allusions to the name, the Vaul meaning, again, we see it with the Valkyrie or the Valkyria. We see it with Valhalla or Valhall. And so it denotes choosing. And that's a truly interesting thing when you consider his father, Volden, or Odin, is the chooser. He's the chooser of the slain. The Valkyries are the ones that physically enact his choosing. He's the Val father. He chooses, the father of choosing. And his hall is Valhall. So again, this immediacy in Vauli is emphasized in his name. That again, it's specific, it's very, very focused, and again, as we read the lore, it seems to be clearly in the sense of correcting immediacy in balance, because as it is kind of seen that in Holder is needed to be taken down because of the travesty that he committed against his brother, but it's not seen as necessarily an extreme case of vengeance where there was a malicious sense of it. It needed to be enacted outside of the intent being criminal. It wasn't criminal, it was accidental, but Vauli nonetheless had to enact it. And this, of course, has a lot of connections to the idea of the darkness of the soul, or the darkness of the folk soul, the blindness of the folk soul, versus the light and the bravery of the folk soul, Baldur, and how those two have to be rejoined in order to create the woad self, as we've discussed previously, not in Victory Never Sleeps, but in some of the Gothar classes on the soul. So I think in a way this is very much that union, but from the gods themselves and their components kind of unifying to create that perfect self that must be contained till it can be released. And Valley is the trigger.
Well, one thing I'm excited about, I don't know if you guys talked about this 2 weeks ago when you guys did Vidar, but when we're able to establish Hoffs to these gods that are as obscure in the lore as they've come down to us. I think that's a very special opportunity for us to build and develop a relationship with divine powers that our folk have not given due reverence to in a very, very long time. I think more so than any of the others on our list. And I think that's kind of a special opportunity. So much of this is something that we can be part of, that foundational generation of building those associations with these gods and building that relationship in a way. You know, I've always theorized, and you guys may have heard me say this before, but the lore is very, very helpful, and we're very blessed that we have it. But our connections to our gods is in our very bones. And if we found ourselves, you know, in a different time, in a different place with no lore, we exist, our gods exist, and we'd still be able to build a relationship with them in some way. And I think in a lot of ways, we're forging a fresh path with our relationship with Vidar and with Vali. And so I'm very excited for that. I think that's a really cool opportunity.
I think that a lot of folks have often pondered about exactly how Vali would play a spiritual component, or how his dominion would kind of intermix in our lives. And I really do find the power of Vali is in actions that we cannot pass back through. That oftentimes I've associated him with decisions made at moments in which there are only two choices, or maybe there's a multiple of choices, but the choice that you make allows for no return. An immediacy of action that creates your weird, or it destines you in a direction that the other ones become unavailable. And I've also found him heavily in a warrior ethos, especially when I was a rifleman in the Marine Corps, and the idea is, you know, once the round goes down range, you can't take it back. And so the heavy cost of negligence before, and also while you're there in the immediate moment, knowing that the moment you take that action, there's nothing else. You can have another action very similar to it, but that action and that action alone is it forever. And I find that power to be something greatly, it has a lot of power to meditate on, because we don't oftentimes find ourselves, as humans, we don't like to end up in those moments where we have only one choice. And we like to, you know, deliberate, think, have multiple options, or even people helping us. And Vali's true power, I think, resides in thresholds of action that cannot go back. And I think this implies also as well to the universe itself and his interaction within weird. And oftentimes I would say, even as in the god's discretion, he enacts his actions based upon the way the gods have deemed correctiveness that needs to be done as well. Because it is mentioned he is the exact word is losing me. Not a magnificent marksman. What is the word? Well, let me look it up here real quick. It's in the Gylfaginning. He's spoken of as, let me see here. Now of course it's like
most fortunate.
That's it. I knew it was an interesting one, because the reason why I wanted to bring that up, the usage of the word fortunate or lucky, or filled with, in essence, divine happenstance, which our ancestors did not take to mean just haphazardly scattered, but as in essence a buildup of the tipping point that leads towards good fortune, or correct landing of the attainment of the goal. if you will. So I thought fortunate was an interesting choice of word.
Yeah, I think so as well. Something that I think an important connection. We always talk about how luck and the manifestation of luck increases when you're taking right action at the right time. The more you are in the flow of Dharma, the more you are doing things, the right things in the right season, and the more you create a momentum of right action, the more synchronicity occurs and the more you get lucky, as it were. And so I think that's interesting here, especially because so much of what we have on Vali is time sensitive. Like, he didn't sit around and wait for the opportunity. He was born, he hit the ground running to complete his mission. Doing that in a timely way was very important. And I think that, acting in that fashion yields luck. We have some questions stacking up. I know a couple of these are things that I've seen you answer in different contexts. So first one is, to Witan Svan, if giants are forces of chaos and are bad, how come many of our gods are giants and or married to them? Thanks.
Okay, so a couple of things to remember. Jotun has two real kind of deep origins. One is that it is old, ancient. It comes from a long time. And then the other is consumptiveness. Now, the consumptiveness part is, I think, what we would kind of consider more in the chaos realm. But the idea of a Jotun being old or ancient or timed, unremembered, is important. When we look at the classification of Jotun, I think that Snorri Sturluson had some poetic need to place that title on a lot, especially in consideration of the time, and I think also too of his religiosity, which I don't think was highly geared towards rekindling the faith of the gods, but more so keeping in correct, meter of poetry. So you find that mix up kind of, I think, happening. But a Jotun is not like a separate race or a separate being, as it is more so, again, denoting ancientness, and that the gods are not necessarily new beings either, but that the name Aus means a pillar or a structural connectivity, the vertical in the world, or in the worlds, or just in essence of power. And that structuring is about support and about creating structure and order. So when we talk about the Jotuns in context to the lore, there is some necessity to piece things together. But it's worth noting, like, for instance, most people would say, oh, well, the Jotuns come from Ymir. And after Ymir was, flooded, or the deluge of his blood, that Bergelmir and his wife, unnamed in the poem, descend all of those Jotuns. But it's, again, worth noting that in Muspelheim, the sons of Muspel are also considered Jotuns. So if you take the context of them being elder beings, primordial, timeless, unencapsulated by even what I would call the middle world's time, the material world, where time is something, the sons of Muspel and the Jotuns of Niflheim exist before the formulation of Ymir. And it is with these two realms, when we think of Jotuns or beings or powers emanating from there, we have fire, the expansive power, energy, heat, culmination, whatever it might be considered, cosmic radiation, or just the ignition spark. And then you have Niflheim as the proto-matter, all of that which is condensed and outside of time. And when they come close together, they break apart and create the middle, and they fill the gap. And it is described that these Jotuns exist there as well. So it's very hard for a lot of people as they're reading the stories to consider that, as they kind of get lumped all together. And it's, the first Aus, when Buri comes about, he goes into Niflheim, into the creation, into the creation, and he has a son named Bor. And again, it doesn't mention how that is done. It's presumed, obviously, and then it does kind of emphasize that presumption with Bor having his wife Bestla. Bestla, the one who besets or begins things like to beset the table, is the beginning, the structural support in which the foundations of the Aesir will come about from these two powers. And she is mentioned as a Jotun, a Niflheim Jotun, not connection to Ymir. So when we look at Ymir, we see the ancient Jotuns that hold that grudge against the gods, that fate that they have wrought upon themselves. And even then, as we go, it's seen as a generational thing. There are deformities of them, the thirsts that kind of fall from them, and they are, foul and not very bright, and they seem to be of ill intent. And then the Risi are oftentimes seen as Jotnar that are kind of in between. Perhaps they're Niflheim, perhaps they're from Ymir, but they have a sense of intelligence, a sense of movement about them that has an idea outside of vengeance and consumption or destruction. And the Jotuns that they align themselves with the Aesir, become Aesir themselves. It's the same that was done with the Vanir. The Vanir gods, once they bring themselves into alignment, when natural law and cosmic order correctively align themselves, they are often referred to as Aus. Frey is often referred to as like the brightest of the Aus, or the most beloved of the Aus. And so I have always taken it that when we talk about divine forces that align themselves with the gods in either betrothal or in aiding them, or overtly aiding them, and then also by bearing children, or in essence, another divine being comes from them co-mixing their energies or their dominions, and a new form or wave takes place, you find that alignment is very important to consider. So again, with Rindr being the mother of Váli, in essence, she has aligned herself with the Aesir. And again, I would even argue with Gridr, who is Vidar's mother. And she is another, again, dominion aspect of the primordial natures of the earth. A lot of the conflict of the earth and the power and the pressure of the earth. Gridr also helps Thor. She gives him an iron rod to protect himself. And so, again, overtly aiding the gods. And I think that was not lost on our ancestors when they heard these stories.
I think there's a progression and an evolution there that's a thing as well. When you deal with the Jotnar, as Svan said, there's a lot of different varieties, but in a fundamental way, they very often are very primal forces that aren't governed by consciousness, that aren't governed by the higher self. They're governed by the lower nature. They're very primal. They're very ancient. Always this idea of these old and, venerably wise creatures from the primal realm. And you see that. And as time goes on, that's where our gods come from. And as time goes on, there's this progression that happens. Just as Odin and Vili and Ve find, logs, or they find something existing on the beach, from that was, they imbue it with these gifts of divinity, the goodly hue and the spark of consciousness and the breath of life. These things then become Aryan mankind. You have this generations of these primal, very powerful, very potent primal forces, and from them is born these forces of consciousness. And you see that when Odin and the Aesir are separate from the Jotnar, they're the forces of consciousness. They're the astral. They're upward facing and forward leaning and evolving into something more. They have this consciousness directing them. And as you see, Jotnar choosing to interact with this consciousness and become more, then they get incorporated, or perhaps they get married to an Aus, and they become more, and it's a little bit different of a category. But you have these that are stuck in the primal, that are forces of chaos and chaotic destruction and consumption. And also you see their offspring that are outside of that astral consciousness become deformed ogres and mutants and freaks. And I think you really see that process. And then there's something to be said about our gods, these forces of consciousness, going back and seeking, and mating with these very primal elements in order to produce new gods, or in order to produce new spiritual life into the world, like we see with Váli. And I think that's potent as well to think on. You notice this degradation of things. There's within chaos and within the primal, there's this very potent magic. You often see the very old and the more lofty Jotnar are great magicians and have magical power. And you see Thor put up against this magical power when he travels in the east and he's fighting the Jotuns. And I think there's something for that. When the Aesir have to tap into the primal in order to, to add that potency in these things. So much of what we see in our lore is a duality between the astral, or the consciousness, and the primal. And that needs to be in the right order. If it's inversed, and if the primal is overruling the astral, you have chaos and you have disorder. But when it's inversed and you have the astral that's controlling and directing the primal chaos, that's when you see some of the most potent magic in our lore occur. And so the Jotnar is a very complex question, because they're not built of different stuff. Jotuns are different than gods, are different than mankind. But fundamentally, we're all pieces of a connected cosmos. And each racial group of people has these things, but it's not as though the Vanir and the Jotnar and the Aesir are fundamentally different, races of people. It's not so much that. There's states of development of divine energy.
Yeah, I joked a little bit over Charming of the Plow, and it was kind of there was a joke about the Anglocentrism of this comment, but worth noting just to kind of mull it over in your mind is like the Jotnar, the Vanir, and the Aesir are not so singularly different. It would be much akin to, and I'm not trying to euhemerize the gods. I'm trying to lay out a map in which perhaps can better help you tackle this subject. Is like the Germans, or the Alemanni, and the Franks and the Anglo-Saxons. Clearly different people, even so, more so over time, and with influences and interactions and with destinies of their own. Each of these three groups have connections, but also their own kind of ideals that make them unique. And so to understand that, I think that a lot of people desperately try to think of the Jotuns as some sort of like comic book characters that are, of an entirely different cut. But Altair Goli did say it best. It is the interaction of divine energies and powers that culminate as these divine beings, these willful, non-corporeal beings. And much of them are in various stages, from the primordial to that which cyclically happens to that which is eternal. And I think
something else that I think is worth noting in our lore, and this is throughout our lore, In the poetic description, noble-mindedness equals beauty. Noble-mindedness equals, fair of skin, clear eyes, noble bearing, strong, proud, straight stanced. And as you get into people who are forces who are controlled by the by the primal, or controlled by the base inclinations of man, and not by nobility, they're depicted very often in a mutated form. They're dwarves, or they're hunchbacked, or they're ugly and warty, or have multiple heads. They're freakish. So the noble, and those who are ascending towards the astral, those who are forward facing, are poetically described as beautiful, and as strong and healthy and robust. And those that stop moving forward, that stop progressing and becoming more, that let entropy set in, they metastasize. You see that as legends where people, become dragons over time, sitting on their hoard, being miserly, and they become deformed over time. Or people who are physically warped by greed, or by by lust, or by gluttony, they become physically ugly as a manifestation of that. And I think that's what you see a lot in the depiction of the Jotnar, especially the later generations of them that coexist with mankind and the gods. Next question is, I have read that Vali is one to survive Ragnarok. Is there a specific reason or cause for him surviving? What do you think, Svan?
No, again, that's another interesting thing that kind of differentiates Váli from Vidar. Vidar is intimately connected to Ragnarok. He is the wolf slayer. He is, Fenris wolf's slayer. He pierces his heart, rips him asunder. Váli is not mentioned. And so he's only mentioned as afterwards, in which then he and Vidar return back into the temples and into the halls of the gods on Eithavoll, which is in heaven. That they return back to those places and find the golden remnants of the foundations of the gods, their parentage before, and that they then too must carry on that goal, that mission of cosmic order. And so, unfortunately, there's really no mention of it, except after the fact. He strides with Vidar back into the halls of the gods, or and in the plane of the gods. Though the Eithavoll is the plane of work, or the toiling plane. It's the place within heaven in which they build Asgard, and so that's how we know he survives. But it doesn't state exactly how. He's not given a place in the poetics. Even Magni and Moldi of Thor take up the weapons of their father, and so it's worth noting that, again, that's why we really hit on it, is that it's so scant in as far as the lore goes, but yet still he pervades and is shown to be there.
So I think there certainly might be more to it than this, but one thing I do think is relevant, and we see it in that myth in particular, is, again, with the generational progression. Ragnarok, in a cyclical sense, is the end of a cycle. It's the culmination and fulfillment of the play, or of the story, and then things start fresh. And we see that anew, because the story of after the waters recede and what they do to reestablish Asgard is very similar to what our gods do in the original creation. It's bringing everything full circle. Now, our gods, because to help us understand them better, and because heritage is so very important to our people, all of our gods have a lineage that tells us about who they are. And most of the gods that we worship are described in some way as a son of Odin. But these gods are different. There's certain gods that are always depicted as a son, as opposed to in their own right, always they are like the next generation of the Allfather. Like Magni and Modi are, they exist simultaneous to Thor, but they are poetically the next generation of Thor that takes it into the new age. And you see that very much in the same way with Vidar and with Vali. This idea, and with Balder, who, again, all the stories connect Balder back to his relationship to his father and mother. He brings that birthright, that heritage of these gods into the new world and into the new cycle. And I think that's a really important poetic meaning of the survivors of Ragnarok, are the encapsulations of that old order that are able to survive whole through a cataclysm and make it into the beginning of the next cycle. And I think a lot of that goes into the secrets that Odin whispers to Balder's ear when he's on the pyre, that transfer to the land of the dead back into the land of the living on the other side of Ragnarok. Next question, also for Witan Svan. Please repeat the meal prayer from the Law Speaker. Folk were asking about it. Thanks. That's very popular. A lot of people want to hear that and use that.
Yeah, and it has been really powerful in my family, and I think in many of the folks here at Thorshoff, and it's a great way to kind of introduce things, especially speaking of ancestral and godly thankfulness, piety towards the gods for the sacrifices that our ancestors made, and for the toil of the work towards bringing that food on the table. I don't know if there's any if Nick's got anything from last. Well, there we go. Man, he's
quick.
God, he's got a lot. He's got that that quick strike that we've been talking about, an immediacy there. Again, and none of this, all credit is upon Witan Turnage, and I don't think that it should detract us from also saying meaningful prayers. I think like when we even at Thorshoff, we do the food prayer together, and then the presiding Gothi or Githia will then say a few personal words that they see fit to contend with the time. But in a way, it's become a way for us to unify together in harmony, or in word, in breath together as we stand, before the meal, or we sit before the meal, and take a remembrance of this moment. And it does really help, I think, with family meals and things of that I think modern day has kind of whittled away. It brought us back into it, I think, for sure. And we don't usually do it like, it's not always like every time, like breakfast sometimes is haphazard with kids doing homeschool and stuff like that. But at night for dinner, it's done. And then to hear the kids do it on their own, giving thanks for meals that they have, is magical.
Yeah, and I'm going to go ahead and recite it because some folks are listening to this on Spotify and don't have the visual aids that the rest of us have.
Ah, yes.
We bless this food to might and main, our bodies' needs to fill, to keep us hearty, whole, and hale, so we may work our will. Ancestors guide us, walk beside us, help us in our needs, keep us on the path that is true, because we are our deeds. And yeah, I think it's beautiful, and I'm glad that more people are using it as part of their traditional blessing of meals. Law Speaker comes up with good stuff sometimes.
Yes.
So the next question, all right, I'll hear your go, Thee. Did you look at Ohio chemical disaster closely? Water, soil, air, all poisoned. Several chemical incidents since East Palestine event there. Hope place for a new Hoff is safe. Yeah, actually, over the last week, I have looked into that, and that's awful. Um, I am trying to think of how to put this. Um, Stuff happens that there's very little we can do about, and everything's not always either everything is perfect or everything's doomed and we're all going to die. I think it's very easy to take an overly optimistic or an overly pessimistic view of some of these things, and I don't think they fit neatly in there. I think this situation is bad, but I don't think that it's so bad that it's going to significantly alter what most folks end up doing outside of the very, very close area there. And I certainly hope that it doesn't. Perhaps that's wishful thinking. I think time will tell. But the Ohio Valley and Ohio itself is old. We have a lot of good things there. This may affect where exactly the new Hoff goes. We don't have a site picked out for Frey's Hoff that'll be in Ohio yet. So fortunately for us, we do have the luxury of picking and choosing that spot with the information that we know at the time. And, now's as good a time as any to kind of update. We're doing really well on that. Got a whole process on doing these Hoffs. We have a plan for our first 12, and I believe we have a plan for our first 14, actually. And the initial 12 gods that we have this plan for, we have a specific order that we're doing them in that's laid out in the Gylfaginning, and we've stuck to that, and we've been very successful with that so far, and it's nice to plot that out. In order to get Freyshoff and make that happen, we need to first pay off Njordshoff, and we're making really good progress on that. Like I said, we're almost 42% paid off on that. Yeah, a week from today, I should, have some different numbers adjusted for what we've been able to accomplish in this last month. So once we pay that off, we're going to got to look at a couple other things to make sure our monthly income overall is a little bit bigger than it is right now. I think that's got to go up. I'll tell you here one second. That's got to increase by about 10%. And, I don't foresee that being a problem. And then we'll be in a spot to scout out exactly what we want to do. Now, I like to dream on these things, and it's silly and counterproductive to my sleep because these are the things that keep me up at night. But I've been looking around at, stuff that's for sale and stuff, in Ohio that we could get a good deal on for, that has the things that we need, and looking at our prospects. And I know none of the things I find today are likely to be there when we're ready for them. But I think it's good for morale, and I can't help it. I'm passionate about it. So it's neat to look at those things. But no, I don't think that this situation in Ohio is going to affect our getting a Hoff there or not at all. At most, it might affect exactly where in the state we get one. But we'll see. Time will tell on that. And, I'm very hopeful that Lord Frey will help guide us to the Hoff that he's going to find most pleasing to him. Next question. What do you think of creatures like Fenrir and Jormungandr? Are they gods or some other kind of spiritual creature? What say you, Svan?
I would say other kind of spiritual creature. Again, when we talk about alignment to the gods, whether it's even spoken of or alluded to in the stories, I think it's worth noting. And then again, too, when you see antithesis even mentioned passively or repetitively, there's an antithesis between Thor and Jormungandr, even though Jormungandr is kind of seen as in a stasis form, biting the tail. Again, this repetitive antagonism then starts to build what exactly is for and against the gods. And as Alzhir said, there's a level of transformation that's symbolically placed out in the stories that talks about their sense of primordialness. And when we look at Fenris in context of the age, if we look at Jormungandr, if we look at even Hel, and we see there's variant levels of, I think, the way our ancestors would have understood these descriptions, these mythological understanding of the gods and the way they're perceived in order to better identify with them. I mean, because a lot of times nowadays, folks will take divinity at face value. They'll make it almost comic booky or literary in the sense that, it's, the wolf and the serpent and that the beautiful maiden that's, half dead in whichever way you vertically, horizontally, front to back. There's lots of different interpretations on that. But again, it's not about what is correct. It's not the face value per se as it is about the meaning behind it. And they take these primordial states that are very, very different from the shining, upright, noble speaking gods. And they do this in these signposts are kind of the way our ancestors saw things, whether they were an immediate danger or an overgrowing danger. Fenris is mentioned as a pup and is brought into heaven because, again, so very important to the structure of our cosmology is the upper, middle, and lower. And the reason why Yggdrasil's roots go, there's one in heaven where Yggdrasil is, and then there is one in the middle and the one farthest away. And, it goes down deeper in. These points have purpose. And it's same thing in this situation. We have Hell descends into the place beyond time, proto matter, all of the things, spiritual might, a place where it can be contained and slowly processed and moved. The middle world is deeply connected to time. And so we see Jormungandr, and it's interesting that he's the stasis. In that middle part is very, very structured. And then Fenris is brought to heaven. He's brought into Eidolon and into the halls of the gods as a pup and grows and grows. And then eventually he's contained and brought back down into the middle world. So definitely I would list them as other beings, most certainly not the gods. I think there has been a great move towards people in our modern day to just really fill this kind of trope of the coolness of something, or I don't even know what to describe it, but it's, again, the chaos and consumption and acceleration through idolizing these forces. But I don't think they're coming from a point of reverence and or certainly not in that case, but also just not even towards what they're actually kind of emulating or trying to, I guess, encapsulate or symbolize in themselves. But they end up kind of taking this sense of like that it's cool to kind of be on the bad guy's side. And again, Alzhir has said it numerous times tonight. We've talked about it a lot. Is the gods are shining, the gods are upright. The hints that we get about Loki start early on with his transformations and his abilities to shift back and forth. And it's kind of, it serves clearly as a warning to the audience of the story being told that Loki is going to be a problem. He's not right. He is wrong and only right when he attempts to placate so that he can continue his wrongness. And that is important. And Fenris, again, too, unmitigated chaos that grows and can consume and crush the top to the bottom and everything in between. And the gods suddenly realized this. And I think so it's important that we don't consider them as gods or Aus.
Yeah. Metaphysical beings don't equal gods. And I think that's important just in our how we put titles to things. Godhood is a position of authority and relationship to us that's very different, especially the term aus, because we are Aesir, we are loyal to the Aesir, or we are Asatru, we are loyal to the Aesir. They are a very specific group of people, and as you've seen, that can be fluid. Other spiritual beings can become Aesir, whereas, and when I mentioned this earlier, when you see the Aesir mate with other Aesir or mate with giantesses, they produce beauty. They produce things shaped like men in a form that we find pleasing, in a form that we find beautiful and upright. When Loki mates, he makes beasts, and he makes freaks, and he makes monsters. In the best case scenario, when he mothers Sleipnir, he's still making a beast. It's a really good beast, but he's making a beast. And when you see, Fenrir and Jormungandr, they're not gods. They're very clearly monstrous beasts, ravenous forces of devouring and constriction in the case of Jormungand. Even Hela is, half of her is beautiful, but the other half is decayed and necrotic. And so you see that malevolence displayed, like I was saying earlier, in the physical look of these people. Our ancestors very much believed, and I think that there is a truth to this, that nobility has a tendency to begat beauty and begat things that are visually pleasing and things that are of heroic, look and feel. And when you have things that are negative, or things that, literally, and we can still see this linguistically, ugly refers to something that looks hideous, but ugly also refers to bad intentions and malevolence. Somebody's behaving in an ugly way, or, man, that was an ugly thing to say. And you see that these are clearly monstrous forces of freakishness, and not forces of beauty and nobility and shining with bright things for us to look up to. We have a question coming from our VK audience. For those of you that don't know, this is being simulcast on VK, and I'm really glad those guys are participating. Is there any prejudice against Russians in the AFA? Absolutely not. Absolutely not. Honestly, if this was like 1970 and at the height of the Cold War, there might be. But at this day and age, no, I think there's a lot of people that are very envious of a lot of where the Russian people are at this point in things. No, certainly culturally and racially and everything else. Now, Russia is a vast country, and there's certainly Orientals that are, Russian citizens. But when we talk about ethnic Russians, absolutely, yes, we really wish that we had ethnically Russian members. Matter of fact, I was able to do and it hasn't come out yet, but I was able to do an interview with a group of Russian Asatru practitioners who were in the Moscow area a little while back. And it was a really lovely conversation with the two of them. I hope we talk to them more. But no, I've always been, since we got removed from Facebook, we've looked for other ways. All of the problems and the Marxism on Facebook, it does happen to be a very wide-reaching platform. So we've looked for other places to go. And one of those places that we really beefed up our presence is on VK. And one of our big hopes was that we would get Eastern European and Russian membership out of it and make connection with those folks, because you guys are our brothers and sisters, and we'd love to have you as part of the Asatru Folk Assembly. Do you have any thoughts on that, Svan?
Not much. I mean, outside, yeah, no, and I think we've had certainly concerns. I know that when a lot of people think of certain things, whether it's like we don't like a lot of the fighting that takes place between folk, but it's worth noting that the reason why we pray to our gods is in hopes of success during war, and oftentimes with each other. Whether the Lombards were fighting the Gepids, or whether the Goths were fighting the Suebians, or whatever we have. There is conflict. Conflict happens. I think the gods see conflict as a metric of. You gotta drag her.
She kept hiding behind my chair so her mom couldn't get her. It's her bath time.
I see that combat as a metric, and I think our gods do see and have seen the conflict and turmoil between folk since we were brought. Life was breathed into us. The Ond was breathed into us. So, the conflict itself can span on a lot of different emotional levels. I know that there are a lot of folks, whether it's the Ukrainians or the Russians, but as far as faith goes and about, the mission of bringing back the glory of the gods to the folk, I don't think there's no real barriers on that front.
All right. We just got a question with a donation from our loyal listener and donator, Lawrence Forbes, up in Canada with 10 Canadian dollars. Thank you very much for your donation, as usual. As we look back hundreds, thousands of years for our lore, I expect our folk hundreds and thousands of years from now will look back to our time to determine lore also. Should the AFA determine what is the official lore of our day, or leave it up to them? Example: will Alan Turnage's food blessing be considered lore to them then? Absolutely. I'm really glad you asked that question, and I'm glad of everything that comes from. I think this is I usually let Svan go first, but I wanted to jump on this one because I'm passionate about it. I think this is something that we all fall victim to, and I think especially when we're new, for a couple of reasons. Abrahamic faith is faith that's based very literally and very specifically on a set of revealed teachings that, in the most fundamentally literally way, their God directed a hand to write on a piece of paper these exact words. So their Bible or their Quran in most schools of those faiths is like literal quotation of their God. Our lore is very different. Our lore is a cultural understanding that's come to our people through generations of different people at different times, at different places, and it's fragmentary, and it's through experience, and it's through revelation of certain, wise individuals and communities, and it's tested through continual cycle of gift giving in exchange with the gods, and it becomes more true if over time it's true, or more true if it's true in different places. But there's a much bigger process, and it's messier in a way, but it's also much more beautiful because it's this tapestry of these different gifts that were given to our Gothar over time. We look back on ancient things and venerate them because they're old, and I think that's really cool. I mean, I love history as much as anybody else. I love those things. I love archaeology and anthropology and studies of history, and I love every bit of that. But it's really important to consider how these things came about. At no point in time do we believe that the gods rode down on their steeds and surrounded, Gothi Einar and said, "Yo, Einar, this is exactly what I want you to write down." It's not how that worked. At the time when any of our lore was written down or was conceived and spoken, it was because the Gothar of the time, who were respected and trusted and who had gravitas, wrote these things down or told these stories based on revelations that happened to them in the course of dreams, in the course of visions, in the course of a life of gift giving between the Aesir and those Gothar, to learn that wisdom and to have that perception of how the divine world functions. And this wasn't a one and done thing. This was over generations throughout the span from Iran to Ireland, and from the Viking Age back into the Stone Age. And over all that time, we've developed this lore, and it's evolved and it's taken shape and it's been refined to make sense. It's not something that I ever want us to do or to think flippantly of. But I don't just think it's, a privilege. I think it's our duty to keep evolving the faith of Asatru forward. I mentioned earlier how the noble forces of the Aesir, they're upward facing or they're forward facing. And these forces of chaos, these, the freakish metastasized Jotnar, are forces of bringing everything down and stopping progress and stagnancy. And when we do that, we become ugly and hideous. We become beautiful and ennobled by moving forward in a pious and faithful way. And we're trying to build those relationships so that the things that we do develop now, that our ancestors will look back on and view as part of the overall corpus of our lore, are the right things and things that are done and said responsibly. And we try very, very hard to live up to that. We would never want to be disrespectful or blasphemous in any way. But absolutely, I think these things will be discussed and looked back on, if we're doing things right by our descendants as part of our holy lore. And I certainly think Alan's beautiful food blessing will be part of that. Thank you for asking that question. I think it's a very good question. Do you have any thoughts on that, Svan?
No, I think you covered it. I think that that's one of the things that differentiates us from others, is that, like you just said, if we're doing things right, our descendants will know and remember and continue on. I think a lot of people nowadays are accused of being just now hollowed, or their intentions are not so severely sincere and aggressively built towards the actual goal of reuniting the souls of the people to the gods. They're some people, it may be just some sort of exercise of entertainment. I don't know, again, what that would be, but we are not that. So that's the only thing I'm just overemphasizing something you just said.
No, there's a very big difference in being a reenactment and being a living faith. And especially in Aryan spirituality, with our emphasis on movement and on dynamicism, it's very important that we grow and that we become more and that we become better and that we ascend. Other folks that practice things that perhaps they think are similar, it's a big difference between LARPing and not LARPing. If you're reenacting something someone else did, or you're pretending, and I don't mean that as insulting of a way as it sounds, but if you're trying to put yourself in a different time or a different place, or act as though you were a different person, to me, that's not living up to the piety of a true religion, to where you're being you in the place and the time that you are in, practicing our faith in a relevant way that interacts with our gods and our people and our life. that's the difference in this being meaningful to the generations to come and not. If it's just a historical reenactment, that might be fun. But what we've seen so much in the AFA is the more relevant this is to our daily lives, the more we build an authentic relationship with our gods, and the more they integrate themselves into the flow of our life, because we see them as here and now in our life, as opposed to existing in a Viking time capsule.
Yeah, that avoidance of escapism that I think a lot of people fall in, and we look forward and currently and now and into the future.
And it's very easy to do. Like I said, we're all history fans.
Yes.
We all look back at time periods like, man, I wish I lived back then. If I lived back then. And we all have a rose-colored view of what that time would look like. If we lived in medieval times, we'd all be nobility, and none of us would be serfs. None of us would be, cold and hungry. We'd all be feasting and jousting. So I think that we all fall victim to that. I think it's just something we need to be mentally vigilant against falling into. All right, next question. Do you believe that the Jotnar / Thursur / Muspel Symir are the evil side to be eradicated from Norse mythology, or do you prefer the idea that chaos is primal and there's no order without chaos? What are your thoughts on this, Svan?
Eradication, again, when we're talking about the entire essence and the movement of our stories, I think eradication is like a title or a concept that's not actually even in place in the entirety of the stories. This is the conflict between order and chaos is set to meet in a head-to-head, and the immediacy, or I guess the purpose that we could see from humanity's standpoint, is that, do you aid the side that brings order, or do you aid the side that brings chaos? And so you could say maybe the desire to eradicate comes from maybe the vigilance and the self-imposing of desire to aid order, and I could see that happening and formulating. But as far as specifically, if we're talking about the children of Muspel, the sons of Muspel, they were in place before Yggdrasil. They were in place before the Great Wood, structured the worlds. The erratic, you see what I mean? Like that's, we know this. They have been the instigating part of the creation of the cycle, and they're the end part until they are slated, and then it starts again. So would the eradication, I would do one better and say there seems to be a great order in that sense, and to eradicate those elements of chaos would then disrupt the cyclic order that is already set and been contained, and is going to happen and move forward and back. If we remove that piece, then it does truly fall into chaos. So interesting. I know that's the debate, does order come out of chaos? Is chaos truly guided by its place within a greater order? That's an interesting topic to kind of go back and forth on. But I would say that the eradication of those elements of chaos would then destabilize the cyclic order that is established.
All right, so I'm going to take a little different take on this. I think that your question is good guys and bad guys. Absolutely. The Aesir are the good guys. The other team is the bad guys.
Side to order.
I've said this before. Well, we're scared of saying good and evil because we've intellectualized it to say that rather than good and evil in our cosmology, it's order versus chaos. And I think that's true, but I think it sugarcoats a point. We're Asatru. Asatru does not mean, as many have mistranslated it, belief in the Aesir. Doesn't mean belief. It means troth to. It means loyalty to the Aesir. We stand loyal with the Aesir, which means we are on their side against their enemies. The forces of chaos, the Jotnar, Loki and his spawn outside of Sleipnir are on the other team. We will seek to eradicate and defeat and destroy and crush the other team as best we possibly can. Now, because of everything Svan say, I don't think the world works like that. The balance of those things and the interplay is what gives everything context, which is the rest of your question. But that's external and beside the point. We fight against things we may never completely win on, but there's value in the struggle and there's ground to be gained in the struggle. Every inch we take from chaos and bring under order is an inch that's better. Yes, if we eliminated all chaos from existence and there was only order, it'd be a very strange situation. And I don't know how that would play out, but that's for the gods to figure out. It's my job to be loyal and stand with them and fight on their side. And I'm not going to try to win less in order to preserve some balance. One of the other thing that I think is really important, there is no heroism and no honor in neutrality. Choosing not to take a side is worse than being on the wrong side. There's a lot of people that are misguided, that are on the wrong team, that I can respect them because they stand for something. They have a code. It may not be my code, but they have a code. If you just kind of wait and I'm everybody's friend, I like to work with everybody, there's no glory in that. You avoid some of the big pitfalls, but you also avoid all of the honor, all of the glory, all of the things that make heroes. There's heroism in picking a side and being stalwart and loyal and on fire for that side. That's where you find heroism. That's where you find glory. The point is true that without an antagonist, there is no hero. That doesn't mean we celebrate the antagonist. We make the best of the situation that's presented to us. We seek to eliminate all antagonists. And, I don't think that's the way the world works. I think there will always be something to be an antagonist force. But you look at every hero, they fight against the bad guy. It doesn't mean the villain should be celebrated too because he's necessary for the story. That's such a removed and aloof way of looking at life. Life is meant to be lived in the moment, in the arena, for honor and for glory, to ascend and become a hero. You don't do that by, pondering the moral relativism of the need for, well, evil's got to exist. It's those questions. When we ask those questions and shrug our shoulders and throw up our hands, we abdicate that breath of life that the All-Father gave us. We abdicate our birthright as noble people to take a stand and to stand on principle. And that's one of the most, we live in an age where the real heroes are people with disabilities, or the real heroes are people who are mentally ill, or the real heroes are, victims of things. No, the real heroes are people imbued with the frailty of mankind that still choose to stand up proud and tall for what they believe in, consequences be damned. And they face those consequences. They either fall gloriously or they transcend and they overcome. But heroism is what we celebrate in Asatru. We do that by standing with the forces of order, with the Aesir. If somebody breaks in your house with the intent of murdering your family and you defend yourself and you slay the intruder, we don't give thanks to the intruder for giving you an opportunity to be a hero. No, we damn the intruder and we celebrate you for your heroism. The fact that the one had to exist for the other to happen is a circumstance of nature, but it's not something to be celebrated.
Yeah, I think when speaking of that, circumstance of nature is kind of where I was focusing on the overall. But yeah, good and evil. If we're talking about that, what is good? Good is my family. Good is my kin. Good is my people. good is my God's. Anything against that, it is incumbent to desire to eradicate, to fight against that which is the antithesis of what is good. But yes, I was speaking more of I think the cyclical parts of the mythos, the stories. So, but yes, I'm glad you reeled it back in.
No, because there are two questions. The postulation that, in a completely objective way, you need forces to counterbalance and you need chaos to counterbalance the order and provide the context. Those things are true. They're just not relevant to the struggle. In any of the wars of our present or of our ancestors, you need the enemy, because if you don't have the enemy, how can you, display your martial prowess? You can't, but it doesn't mean you celebrate that. Without the villain, there can be no hero, but it doesn't mean the villain gets celebrated. Far from it. We climb mountains that we'll never be able to see the top of, because to do so is the right thing to do, not because we could possibly eradicate what's before us, but by standing in opposition to it, there's glory in that. King of Cheese. Howdy, Matt and Svan. How are we doing tonight? I'm doing glorious. I'm always doing glorious on these. You know this, Tony. I love these. I look forward to them every week. I've actually had a really good day. The AFA had a new high number today. Current member number is sitting at 993. We are really close to that 4-digit number. I'm excited about it. We also had a really awesome call last night planning. So, okay, as an aside, to take a break from the deep lore and the good and evil talk for a second, I couldn't figure out what this guy's called. And I found this guy, and he says that he doesn't know what this guy's called either. So when we were first starting the Sigerheim project, I was trying to find a guy that does like neighborhood community planning, like the layout of where buildings on a certain piece of land would go and how to do flow of traffic and, roads and spaces that separate and just things that way to lay out like a neighborhood, to lay out those things. And I couldn't find what that guy is. But as would happen, as, Vali, the fortunate marksman, I feel us trying to do the Sigerheim great endeavor at this time has put us in a spot where good things come to us. And we had a former member who reached back out to us, was on fire about the Sigerheim idea. And he is that guy and does that. So we had a really great talk with him last night, laying out where we want to have lots and buildings and roadways and things on Sigerheim. And it was just a really cool conversation, really inspirational, and one more step on, making that project succeed. So I'm a happy guy. How's Svan doing?
I'm doing well. Again, pretty excited. I was on that call as well, to see the talents he brings to manifest that. I think it was also something truly important that you did say too. In the midst of a lot of the excitement, there's still the focus on our goals. There's still the focus on our progressions. There's still, looking towards the Hofs, looking towards Freyshof, looking towards Tiershof, and all of that. At the same time, being able to kind of really put some foundational stuff was amazing. And to get to talk about, because there's a lot of people as this is happening. Strangely enough, weirdly enough, there's a lot of people involved that have very distinct talents that all seem to make the rope, the different strands that make the rope big and strong. And so that was very exciting. Outside of that, everything's good. Bounty is good. God's blessed me. Kids are healthy. My wife and I are we're in such a wonderful state in our life where our children are growing up. We're looking at the future. We're looking about where we can live in the future. It's brought a lot of motion and hope and, again, forward thinking. And so it's kind of like being on a wave that you didn't realize you needed to be on because you might be in a rut or things like that. And it kind of, today was the day of like, wow, I was upset about some of the details I was trying to work out on things. And I was like, I'm being upset about things, but the overall wave that I'm on is is amazing, and I was grateful for it. So it kind of toned me down on some of the stuff I was stressing about, but amazing.
I also have a question about Loki's kids. So would they not be demigods because of the power they wield? So, and I mentioned this, and judging by the next question, maybe we didn't mention it enough. It's not quite that clean, and we're dealing here with an argument over semantics. Certainly, they are metaphysically immense in power. Surt, one of the arch forces of chaos, is tremendously powerful, and I don't dispute his power, but the position of godhood is I guess that becomes the misnomer, and that's why it's a better and cleaner thing for us to refer to Aesir, or as Svan says, the Aus, because the title of Aus implies an alignment that I guess the term God in and of itself doesn't, because God is used differently culturally in different spots. Demigods, and they are less powerful than the gods. Certainly, they are more powerful than mortals. Certainly. So I don't think it's linguistically wrong. I just think it's not the way we would put it in terms of alignment. You got thoughts, Svan?
Yeah, the usage of the word demigod, or the ancient Greeks used the word daemon, and that I think that word too is kind of funny. When you talk to folks, they hear the word like demon, and they wonder where that comes from. That's not in the original Christianity. It was taken from the Greeks to represent like lesser beings, and the biggest thing I would say is, when we look at the stories and we consider the alignment to the gods, we see certain things. For instance, one point of worth noting is that Fenris is a point of power that he wields, certainly, that the gods need to contain immediately, and they do, but it's an immediacy in heaven, stasis and confinement in the middle, and then almost backwards timed or non-functioned in time in the lower. So that kind of understanding of placement and the idea of time and relevancy and essence. When we see Hel as referred to, she takes Balder out of time. She takes him into that stasis point, but treats him well. The idea, again, when you look at like the differences between Fenris and Hel as far as their placement of immediacy, their essence of alignment. The consumption of Fenris is absolute and immediate. He wants it. He wants to consume it. Whereas Hela then is not. She's a place of containment and holding. Now she is, of course, to the source of the calamity, or the end of things. So she's often symbolized as being the source of that which is the end of things: poison, death, illness, of those things. Like it's referred to straw death and things like that. But those are that natural cycle that she's connected to. But to call them demigods, when we get into, I would even wonder about this, like with Hellenics and the way the words like are utilized in those sense. But for us, it's about alignment to the gods. It's about the way the gods interact with. You see this again with Aegir and Raun, or it's spelled strangely, but it's Aegir. Aegir and Raun are Jotuns of the primordial ocean, and they create this alignment with the middle world. And I think it's worth noting. Do we necessarily pray to Aegir and Raun? I mean, there's evidence that we could speculate on, and things that our ancestors might have done. But there is certainly a sense of unilateral like alliance, or perhaps a tentative peace between those forces. And so we would not consider them Aus, but are aligned with. But then when we see betrothal, actual unification, that's an oathing or a physical union that I think is understood by our ancestors, that when there was a betrothal this was a unification. They were joining in with the alignment of the tribe or the people. And so even though they may have been from another tribe, they aligned with the tribe. And then these things, created forward movement. But to call them demigods, and then again, specifically of the power they wield, the Jotuns wield power. We know this. They have great powers as well, and the gods have great powers, and that interplay between them creates things, and we side with the Aesir. So we can see it's clearly an antithesis there between Fenris and Jormungandr. Hell is different in that there is a sense of timelessness. It is mentioned that her realm exists even after Ragnarok, and there's again, it's almost very similar to like Iron Round. So demigods, I think, is not the correct term at all for them.
All right. So next question. What do you think about the fact that some giants are mentioned as very beautiful beings? For example, the giantess Menglod. So this is kind of what I meant earlier about the awkwardness of language. We talked earlier about how there's different varieties of giants, especially giantesses, that end up being giving over their power oftentimes to the forces of order, to the forces of the astral, and becoming something more. The nobly aligned or the forward-facing Jotnar often become more or engage in relationships with the Aesir that elevate them and move them forward, as opposed to that stagnant, ugly state that I mentioned earlier. But I think Svan might have some more to offer on this one.
No, that's exactly the same realm as, again, it's mentioned with Gerd as well, shining arms, and that she is such a striking beauty, that Frey is stricken to darkness and to isolation. I don't think that the idea of ugliness and beauty was seen as more of an alliance or movement in action. If you're moving towards or with or a congruence to, there is beauty. But if you're moving against or away, or even kind of like crossing over the flow lines of things, you end up becoming twisted or untrusted or shrouded, or there's a lot of those key words. So yes, it would be best to look at these nomenclatures of beauty and other things. There is other times too, though, where it can be kind of seen as a sense of a warning of beauty and a warning of the seduction of something, to see something that's greatly powerful and dangerous, but yet still see a beauty in it. There is that as well. But I think that we're talking about forces, and that language is utilized about movements with and forward and aligned to, versus crossing, breaking, and turning away from, or deeply reflecting that within those descriptions.
Yeah. All right. This is a question. For someone starting out, if I make an offering inside, should I pour it down the drain? I'm glad that you asked this, because I think that sometimes people don't ask these really practical questions. But that's something I think all of us have stopped and considered when we first started and we did any kind of altar work in our house. It really depends. If I make an offering inside of food, it's a little bit different. If it's a beverage, sometimes I'll let it sit there. That said, I think I got my cats drunk before doing that unintentionally. So I don't know. It depends if you have pets or what's going to happen to it. Because I think that, there's not some point where the gods descend and physically consume the food and the drink that's on your altar. I think that, maybe they do for you. And in that case, you're very, very special indeed. But that hasn't been my experience. What I think that I saw over in the side that most of us do when we have an offering inside and then we're looking to get rid of it. Many of us have a special place in our yard that we do that. Very often it's around a special tree. And then, as nature would have it, those things just magically disappear. And I'm sure that's because of predators or birds or scavengers or, local dogs or whatever that way. But the essence of what you're doing, and I've said this 1,000 times, the gods don't need, a quarter cup of mead or a chunk of bread or something for dinner. It's the thought and the energy that you're putting into it. And I very much believe that's received. And I don't think, as long as your attitude's right, I don't think pouring it down the drain is a terrible thing. I just think it's a little bit more special to pour it on something special outside, on a tree. Sometimes people have a horg or an altar they've made of rock outside that they put their offerings on. So having a special place in your yard, or if you live in an apartment, I don't know your situation, but something, on the property, like I'd say, the best option is a nice tree, and place it at the base of that. That's what most of us end up doing. I don't think that's some hard and fast rule. I think that's just what most of us have been inclined to do, and is kind of caught on as the culture of what we do. Next question. This is a good question. I want your take on this, Svan. Why is Sleipnir considered different from Loki's other children?
Well, okay. I didn't see that. It didn't pop up on that one, but that's okay. Yeah, when we see this situation, first and foremost is kind of the consideration of the players involved, if you will. When we talk about Angerboda and, the siring of Fenris that assaults the heavens, and Jormungandr that constrains the middle, and Hela that resides in the timeless under. We see some interesting points of the stratification. Sleipnir is movement, deep, quick, fast movement. The symbology of the legs is movement. So what ends up kind of emphasizing in Sleipnir's case is that there's like this assistance to dynamicism, and it, I think, has more to do with the players involved, as far as the Jotun's horse and Loki and the production thereof. And in reality, it's less about even the escalation of dynamicism on Odin's part, but I think it's also more poignant of the beginning signs of what Loki is to. It's kind of like a prelude, an indication of that which is, and it sets a motif throughout the stories. Some actions and things that are done bring about beneficial things, and others bring about non-beneficial things. So I've always taken that Sleipnir is an addition to the dynamicism of Odin, but more so important, the prelude of what is to come. And I think that as the stories were told, our ancestors would see this as a sign of, oh, something's not right. Because this kind of way that the problem is resolved is done in a very outside of the good way of things being done. But something good comes of it. So let's keep going. And then something bad happens, and then something good comes of it. So let's keep going. And I think that overall arching story is the buildup of the warning that's to come. And I think the overall moral, if you will. So as far as Sleipnir being, the horse is the vehicle of movement, order. Symbolically, we see that always connected with the sky, always connected with the cosmic. Again, this takes place in heaven. This a lot of people think that like Asgard is the entirety of heaven, but yet it's referenced clearly that the gods live in Idavol, and this takes place in heaven in the outer bounds, or not outer bounds, but the outer bounds of Asgard, where the well is, where Yggdrasil is, where that place is outside of Asgard. So in heaven, the production of that extra dynamicism doesn't strike me as odd that it takes the shape or the symbolism of a horse, because it happened in heaven. But when Loki goes down and into the east and into the primordial and into the middle world, and there he sires with Angrboda, that which is made stratifies through all the worlds, and that's interesting. I think that's the way we should engage the stories, is understanding how mythological language works to paint meanings that are deeper by movement. We see a lot of the movement involved there. So I would say Sleipnir is a horse because the production and the players involved and the overall motif took place in heaven.
Well, I think something else that's very relevant too, it's Odin's steed. Odin has the ability, unlike any other of our, to a degree, unlike any of the rest of our gods, to master chaos, to master those primal forces and transmute them for his will. He literally did that with the existence of our folk. He dismembered chaos in order to reshape and shape order. For him to have the mastery of a steed, and certainly the relationship between breaking a horse and riding and being the master of that horse, is something that our ancestors would have understood. Odin also has 2 pet wolves. That's remarkable. You don't keep pet wolves. Wolves are savage and wild, and a freaking Gary, like devourer and ravenous, and you don't. That's not what you keep as pets. It's what Odin keeps as pets, because he can master those savage forces of chaos and bring them under his dominion, bring them under his will. And that speaks to the might of Odin's will as much as any other element in that story, I think. You see Sleipnir, but he's not made like a horse. He's a horse, but he's got a freakish number of legs. You can use that for benefit. Certainly that is beneficial. And I think there's symbolism in the number of those legs. But the idea that Odin is powerful enough of will, he is the master of the woad, the master of the inspiration, that he can take these forces under his power and bring them under his dominion. I think that's a big part of that as well. King of Cheese, speaking of Sigerheim, how many acres does it contain? Just about 70, just shy of 70. Is it appropriate to compost a food offering, using it to nourish the earth and garden? Seems like it would be appreciated by the gods. You could make it appropriate. That's one of the things, is so much of it's about intention. I don't know how your composting works. If it's just another garbage can with different garbage stuff in it, then probably not. I'd still leave that out. If you are distributing it into your garden and you want to break up your food offering and distribute it in the garden as well, I think that's a reasonable thing to do. But if your compost is just a different kind of garbage, just like your recycling cans and your garbage than your compost pile, I think that would be less optimal, or something I wouldn't do. But so much of it is with your intention. And I don't think, as long as your heart's right when you're doing it, I don't think that our gods are grossly offended one way or another, as long as you're not being disrespectful.
Transference too of the object after death. Something to consider is, like you had said, you had left liquid out, and then the cat might have gotten into it. But the point is once the moment of the gifting is given, that item, whether it's we see this with blades and stuff from elder times, and then placed in the bogs. And we know there are other things that were placed in bogs as well. And those two, why would you put a gift in the same place that you would put a bane or something foul? The idea is that, especially like once you lay the mead or break the blade, or if the flowers are given and fruits are given and they are gone and begin to kind of sink and die, then the gift is given, and now it can move to a place of just being part of that cycle again. So some people do view their offerings as given in the moment and taken in the moment, and then after that is disposed of in whatever way they see fit. But culturally, we lay those things to waste in a sense of reverence. Most often in every cultural kind of aspect within the Asatru folk assembly, you'll see the pouring out of in a sacred place, or the laying of that stuff in a hole, or burned, or laid to water. But again, it's kind of seen as it's given and taken at that moment.
All right. Next question is, Skavi is a Jotun, right? Yes. Yes, she is. And we see her elevation when she comes into contact with the Aesir, when she interacts with them in a noble way, seeking, vengeance, retribution for the death of her father. And she's treated well, and her interaction moves her in that, that category shift we talked about earlier. What are your thoughts on that, Svan? Can you add something to clarify?
Yes. Again, the alignment. Yes, she is a Jotuness, or she is seen as a force that comes out and then within, and then later on, after her alignment, her realm is even mentioned, Thrymheim, as a poignant realm for the gods. So again, I think that hammers that alignment together. But the betrothal and that story, which may have a lot of different meanings depending on, some talk about cycles of water, some talk about the creation of rivers by like icebergs or glaciers, and things like that. There are physical things that could be kind of correlated to the story, but it is then seen as she's in alignment. So the question I think a lot of people are hounding about on these questions is, like, do we pray to her? Again, when we talked about, like, even Ayr and Raun, there was references to sacrifices given to gift towards Ayr for safe passage. And this was not necessarily done out of devotion and reverence, but almost as if a sense of bargaining. And I think that is another interesting relationship that we have with our gods versus these elements that may be in alignment with the gods, but are not entirely gods themselves. But betrothal, or the bearing of children, I think is a good definitive point, a point in which those powers begin to cross. And I don't think Snorri really does that, because poetically it's not poignant to say, but it is seen as it's referenced. Again, why would they name one of the great realms as Thrymheim to be in alignment, unless, of course, she is now aligned with the gods? So yes, but again, is Mimir a Jotun? Clearly. Is he the uncle of Odin? Clearly. So it's not so clear cut, and the idea is, again, it's about the alignment in which. And so I think a lot of referencing that Snorri does to the Vanir and to the Jotuns is about the sourcing of where they come from, but it alludes to the alignment there forth after that meeting, after that event, or those interactions. Then they proceed forward.
All right, next one here, and I understand, and I'm glad this one was asked. So Good evening, gentlemen. I was curious if you could expand upon the warrior principle of our statement of ethics. I've had family members have concern for it alluding to nefarious activities. For those that are unfamiliar, the warrior principle is as follows. We believe that our members should strive to be ready for the challenge to defend our folk, gods, and goddesses with both cunning and physical skill when needed. We should be prepared to stand against those forces which would seek to destroy our gods and folk. And it's, I've answered this question before on Expedition Truth with Reverend Jack Ashcraft, and somebody asked that question, and it didn't seem odd to him at all because he's an older man, and a few generations ago this wouldn't have been a strange question at all. We live in a society to where so much autonomy has been taken out of the hands of the citizen and put in the hands of the state that we become very uncomfortable talking about any matter of self-defense, no matter what that be. And, even right now talking about it, I'm aware that people who listen to this or YouTube will take some confusion. And it's not that at all. If you read that, it talks about with cunning and with strength to stand up for our folk and our gods. There's a lot of ways to do that. And it escalates. It says, in our strength, if necessary. Our principles and the principles that we have to believe in exist outside of laws and are tempered by laws. But in a state of no laws, then of course we should be ready to fight to protect ourselves and our gods. We live in a social contract where there are other agencies that do that, and where we border on criminality if we were to do that in a certain way. So the AFA has always been clear that we obey the laws of the countries we reside in, and that we act appropriately that way. But it takes out the idea with cunning there. Defending ourselves with cunning has everything to do with strategy. It has everything to do with legalities, with standing up for ourselves in court, standing up for ourselves in the media, standing up for ourselves in the public square, with standing strong for what we believe in. And so often, especially white people and especially white males, are vilified for standing up for themselves, even in the most simple way. But this would be, anathema to our ancestors. It's worth putting in that statement of principles that, stand up and be counted. Stand up and fight for your rights. When we talk about people fighting for their rights, we're not talking about gun battles. First and foremost, we're talking about letting your voice be heard. Secondly, we're talking about pursuing the legal rights that the law literally exists to protect for us. And there's many ways to do that. One of the most fundamental ways is to stand up and be counted instead of being scared to say who you are and to speak truth to power and speak truth to those around you in the media and the public square. Our people duck their heads and, hope not to make a noise. Be proud, stand proud. Speak about who you are. Certainly, there's when it comes to physical violence, many of us are involved in various degrees of self-defense that are enshrined in our Constitution, that are a fundamental part of all of our jurisprudence, is that a man has a right to defend himself and his family, and we have a right to defend our people. And again, the politics around stuff change, but given any number of conflicts, the idea to take up arms defending our faith and our gods could very well be completely congruent with the mission of the armed forces of the country that we live in, depending upon what that threat is. To stand ready to fight for what we believe in is a noble value, and it used to be something that was embraced by most churches, was for you to be proficient in self-defense, proficient in defense of yourself, your country, and things that share common values with you. I think the only reason that this statement sounds quote unquote nefarious to certain people is that we don't share the same values with the world around us in this day and age. The melting pot is far too diverse at this point for us to consider the idea of standing for our folk to be synonymous with standing in defense of our country or our state. I think at any previous time in our history before, the last 50, 60 years, the idea of fighting for your folk very much meant the idea of, taking up arms in your country's military against nations such as China or anything else. It sounds odd to us today, but I think that if you made that comment to fight for your folk, and this was 1930, I don't think any of us, as Americans would have found that an odd thing to say or an odd thing to think. I think the day and age that we live in, where we're so scared of conflict, becomes the issue. But if you read that statement, it talks about being wise, it talks about using cunning, and if necessary, standing up for yourself physically. There's any number of situations where people wish to do us violence because we believe differently or who we are, or who our race is. I think any of us, if we look at our Twitter feeds or anything else, we see horrendous acts of violence that are committed against people that look like us for us being members of the folk. And we have had numerous threats from elements of the left to do physical violence to us because of our faith. Standing ready to protect ourselves in those situations isn't nefarious, nor it's illegal. It's completely legal and appropriate. It's all about context. The AFA and none of our principles advise anyone to do anything illegal. We never have, we never will. That's not what we're doing. We've never had a problem with that. We've never had a negative interaction with law enforcement. Our warrior principle is about vigilance so that we stand ready to protect ourselves if the need arises. And that could be in any number of different contexts. Do you have anything to add on that, Svan?
No, I think you systematically, broke that down. I think there are a lot of people out here who, I've even seen it when, in relation to people that have taken an oath to defend the Constitution, in this day and age. That even comes with a sense of but 50 years ago, nothing at all. That would have been so alien of an idea, so outlandish, that it just wouldn't be entertained. So again, I oftentimes, when I think of people that try to make you question or stuff, if it's family, of course there could be concern or worry or something of that nature, but a lot of people try to attempt to pacify people's intents or make them get caught up in some sort of trap that it is nefarious and cunning. But no, a warrior stands and believes and holds true for himself, for his family, for the gods, for his nation, for his people. You hit it all right there. There's nothing I can say.
And these are fundamentally American principles, and I don't think there's anything wrong with that. But I would also say I understand that family are going to have concerns. If they do, and you can prove this, and don't just Google search AFA because it's not going to show things that necessarily put us in the best light. But the Asatru Folk Assembly has never, ever been implicated in illegality or violence or nefarious doings of any kind in any official legal capacity. You have angry people on the left that throw around accusations, but none of them have ever been true about us. If you look at our interactions that we actually have with our community, we literally feed, I think, over 1,000 families every month, if not very close to it, with our food distributions. We're good neighbors. If you ask the people that know us, I think that would allay a lot of those fears. What are the plans for the 2 Hoffs in addition to the original 12? All right, so we're still talking about this. This is not official. This is just ideas out there.
You threw it out there.
I did, because I'm proud of it, and whatever, we're just deciding. So those 12 are locked in stone is what we're going to do. But after that, the next 2 Hoffs that we are considering at this time is a Hoff to Frigg and to Freya. and they certainly deserve Hoffs, and we would love to honor them and worship them with that in that way. And that's the next two after the 12 that we're currently thinking about. Now, again, I've surrounded that in as much, waffling as I can. So don't hold me to it if something happens between now and then. We're talking about Hoff 13 and 14, and we've only really got physically 4 right now. So it's going to be a few years. But yeah, that's our current thinking on that. Svan, any relation between Woden and Wode, the blue paint / dye used to dye things or to paint the body?
Yeah, I was okay. One of the interesting things linguistically, there may be because the word Wode or the root word, or perhaps the root word that exists both in Gallic and in Teutonic language or Germanic language, is again associated with fervor, with ecstatic states, and the usage of Wode in the Gallic sense, especially the island Gauls or the Isle Gauls, the Picts and the Irish, or the references that was brought about with the usage of the blue paint, coming specifically from that herbal Wode dye, and that it having a linkage to ecstatic behavior for battle and ecstatic kind of or perhaps even because my looking into that as far as like chemically and how that, if it does have some sort of effect, whether perhaps maybe it was mixed with something else to have a topical effect, or if it was ingested as well as being topically applied, or something. I haven't hit a lot of official things in that area, but I think also too it may have connection to the I don't want to say the aesthetic of war between the tribe itself having this connection of brightness, but also to the fear that it causes and the essence of its what it does to the enemy. I think, if we're looking at it before, say, even the Romans, who are the ones that marked on it about the usage, that it was used between each other. The Gaulish people of the Isles were probably painting themselves up when fighting each other, or perhaps maybe that was even a status of a type of battle that was far more significant than maybe just a skirmish, in which there was some ritualistic thresholds that had to be like, this is a big one, this is going to affect everything, we need to prepare ourselves for this, and there may have been some elevation to that. But I've looked into, like, again, is there a physical topical effect that comes from it or ingestion? I haven't found anything of real importance other than perhaps the name of the herb came from it being a component in a mixture of things. And so it was just simply that plant which creates the blue Wode paint is Wode, but also that it may have been mixed and added to create an ecstatic state. That's an interesting topic in and of itself, but tangible connections between the herb itself and the paint, no, but the root word and perhaps maybe that meaning, yes, I do believe it does, because it stems all the way back, Proto-Indo-European, for fervor, fury, and an ecstatic state.
Yeah, I tend to think that as well. It's linguistically too close not to be, and the idea of separating, I don't know, it may seem strange to us now, but the idea of donning that kind of special war paint for battle was a religious rite. Doing that was believed. It's one of the reasons they fought with the Wode and not with a bunch of armor and other things, is it was supposed to protect you and be an armor in and of itself. It had a spiritual might to it. So I think the connection to spiritual might is connected in both of those uses of the term. But I think it's a loose and distant connection. Next question is, would you say that the Old Norse people were less honored for being more neutral regarding their worshiping, taking into account the small evidences of veneration of good-looking to some giants? What is your take on that question, Svan?
Old Norse people were less honored for being more neutral regarding their worshiping. That part, the first part, you could definitely see an escalation with foreign elements when Christianity was coming into the Norse period. We saw the mentioning of the Christians saying that that women that are of the old faith do not, or they wear turtle breeches. Christian women don't. They don't adorn themselves with these things. We see it again with the Thor's hammer and the cross. And there was like this escalation of molds that were made at that time to facilitate the desire by people in the community to kind of show their lack of neutrality, if you will. I'm sure there were people who were neutral. I know that some Icelanders were remarked at being kind of in both in regards to certain things. But the latter part of the question, as far as connection to the Old Norse people and worshiping, like I guess what you're alluding to is like maybe worshiping non-aligned Jotnar. Or maybe I wonder if taking into account the small evidence of venerations of good looking to some giants. I mean, again, I would say it's that you see it a lot more in placation. Sometimes placation towards the gods, asking for things, and then also even kind of trying to duck fate when given the boons of the gods is often seen as calamitous, and it's brought about with, oftentimes in the stories, they're great instigators of a whole series of events that's going to happen. But I would assume that there might have been a lot of people that had problems with if somebody was taken to overly venerating chaotic forces that were outside of the gods, that there may have been. But as far as accounts that I can tangibly point to, I don't. But you definitely see that the idea of neutrality was not necessarily a thing, or at least archaeologically we know. There's a lot of evidence showing that our ancestors took to, even when there was credence saying like, you can't worship the gods. They were worshiping the gods and collecting food and holding the holy tides, and were punished and oftentimes willing to die rather than accept this foreign religion, which was oftentimes associated with the power rise of an individual who was absolutely willing to accept money or land or titles or loans from the Central Europe where Christianity had established itself. But that's the best I could take that question. It's a little confusing.
Yeah, it is a little bit confusing, but I don't think that, our Old Norse ancestors were particularly known for neutrality. It's hard to say, because there was, one of the things that made our people easily conquerable was the fact that there was no, Old Norse empire. There was all these various different autonomous small groups that, would cascade fold into the bigger economy of Europe, be it the, monetary economy or the religious economy of Europe. And greed and various other things motivate people to make less than ethical choices. Because there was no centralized governing structure, it was much harder for any resistance of that to occur. But I'm not really sure if that's part of the question. I think the question is more because in the Eddas, they describe some of the giants as being good looking, that's somehow a indicator of them being neutral on the spiritual matters. And I don't think at all. I think that's something that Svan and I have tried really hard throughout the show today to say is that's a linguistic gray area to the, chaotic forces of evil Jotnar and the primal forces that come into alignment or into peripheral interaction with our gods in a positive way. There is a whole spectrum of Jotnar, and the ones on the fringes that are evolving into something better, that are giving their spiritual gifts to the gods to further order. They transmute out of that base Jotnar category, and I think they are literally beautified by that. In our folklore, we see, people changing their visual appearance because of these things. We see that throughout our folklore, not just in the Eddas. We see, a person in a story, as they become villainous, they turn necrotic or turn stooped over and twisted and ugly. And as they return to goodliness, to righteousness, to honor, they literally beautify. And I think that is part of the transmutation of the soul in these Jotnar examples.
Just one little thing real quick. Some of the stuff that's worth noting is when I've heard people talk about like, oh, well, the Vikings, they enslaved other, people, European peoples and all that stuff. Again, they're slapping on presentism to a time in the past. And we know, again, we're speaking of autonomous tribal units that oftentimes thought, what is good for my people? And they were talking specifically about whatever those guidelines were. And then once they gave their word to join in perhaps a battle of something that they weren't even involved in. You see this again with Egil Skallagrimsson when he joins to help fight the Scots for the Anglos. And so once he gets paid and once he, takes that oath, he goes forward with that. Or the Varangians, where in Byzantium, the emperor king is killed, and the new person steps in and they bow to the person that their oath to protect the throne, not necessarily just the person. These again are moral things that we look at that time. I don't necessarily think that's a barometer of present time. I mean, again, we know that it's kind of like saying like we shouldn't write down anything about what we're doing nowadays because our ancestors didn't write things down. But knowing that writing things down, or perhaps again being an empire or uniting under one banner, would have perhaps thwarted issues, that it's completely within reason to say, well, perhaps we should do that now because we see what had happened in the past. I don't think that we're locked into the moral framework of our ancestors entirely in everything. Like they had evolved from previous events and understandings of things, and we too continue to evolve in holding that moral correctness, or what we see as the best path to get there.
All right. Next question. Will you folks have a Hoff in the Northeast at any point in the near future? Hopefully. It depends on what near future means to you. Matter of fact, I was just talking with Witan Cliff Erickson, I think yesterday, about that. Maybe the day before. So time frame wise, the next Hoff is going to be Frey's Hoff. It's going to be in Ohio. Following that will be Tier's Hoff, that is going to be on Sigerheim in Tennessee. After that is Bragi's Hoff. And we don't know, that's far enough out that we don't know what situation we'll be in at the time. One area that I would really, really like to see some growth and to get something in is the Northeast. I would love to see something, say, Massachusetts North would be really nice. We don't have the pieces in place for that right now, but by the time of Bragi's Hoff, that may well be a thing. That's what Cliff was saying. He was like, maybe if we angle just right, we could make it to where Bragi's Hoff is up there. There's a couple other spots that are in contention for where Bragi's Hoff might be. Could be in the Pacific Northwest, down in Arizona or in Texas are other options, but Northeast is still very much on the table for Bragi's Hoff and further. Next question is, what exactly does Aryan mean? there seems to be a lot of Middle Eastern and Asian associations with the word. Does this mean Europeans and Asians are one people? Also, can you, and then the question cuts off.
Oh, can you elaborate on Eurasia?
Yeah, I don't know why that's not showing up on my end. Can you, okay, cool. So, yes, Svan, go ahead. I've got some things on this, but go ahead.
Oh, I mean, yeah, first and foremost, like when we talk about the nomenclature of the word in regards to a people, a lot of people like to point out immediately, they speak of the Iranians because they used it in naming the people of that area and ultimately the land in which they had kind of set out. So a lot of people say, no, the Aryans are the Iranians. And then when, of course, we know linguistically through many of the old writings from the Vedic period in Hinduism, the usage of the word Arya and in association with the nobles and with the people coming in from the north into India, there's clear linguistic connections there. Again, what I think it's more important to consider is the usage of the word has changed, but is one pervading connection linguistically. And that's because it has been brought into those regions that you speak of, whether it's Asia, whether it's the Middle East, or whether it's even, again, like in the Hellenics, they have the words like Ariana and Arianus and all of those things where they talk about honor and nobility and those connections. And it even goes so far as to even with the Gauls and their usage, even with the usage of ire, with Ireland and the ire. It all also goes into, and people could say, oh, there's no connection. You don't know what you're talking about. But I mean, the root word structurings of all of these places have a connection to the word, whether it's honor or nobility. But understanding that language is carried by people, and those people have come from a central place and moved into. Europe is unique in the sense that the way it was kind of layered as people moving westward, we see that more as a series of times, because when they look at like the bell beaker or the even all the way back to like the monolith builders and some of the things that they're looking at genetically, and then they look at like the Yamnaya people who they kind of have painted as these, they want to say Yamnaya or they want to say Kurgan because of their death burials, the Kurgan mounds. They want to avoid using the word Aryan, obviously because of political and wartime things. But these people had the word Aryan or Era or Arya or anything in their language, and did it denote like them specifically? It usually meant noble, honorable. So again, it's linguistically there. It's just its usage and how it was used differently by different people. But those people in Europe, you see them in waves, and they try to separate them, or they try to paint the Kurgan or Yamnaya as like these kind of evil, marauding, patriarchal, group that comes in and just kills this like Mother Earth worshipping, basket weaving, peaceful European, communes. But when you look at genetics, they see that the differentiation between the Yamnaya and the pre-existing people there are, the variations genetically are almost like null. And also too, they most likely mixed, even though the idea that they were like just completely obliterating or genociding these people is, I think, politically a narrative they try to push. But again, it's the usage of the word. So do we connect linguistically? Yes, is because the source of where that word comes from, and the people that it comes from, and how it's kind of moved into the Middle East, how it's moved into India, and how it moved into Europe. But as far as like the usage of it applying to the definition or nomenclature of a people, again, looking at who they are as they come into these lands, they are the warrior people, the noble people, the people that have the wheel, the people that have metal, the people that bring the gods that they have, they bring that religion, that faith with them. And that great effect. And that kind of nomenclature isn't always definitively placed down. Has it kind of, as I think as Semitic people, people that speak the Semitic languages, especially like in Iran, yes, there's some intermixing there that you can see culturally. It's the same within India, looking at like in the Northwest as opposed to like Central and South. So when you're talking about genetics and things like that, there's clear differentiations, but in the language, there is a connectivity because we can see that. Any linguistic scholar will tell you that there is connections between Sanskrit to Gaulish and to Latin, and so that connection is there because of that movement, because of the invasion theory, as a lot of people call it, and some people have tried to disclaim it, and then genetics has absolutely proven it to be true. But utilizing it in reference to honor, to nobility, and to an overall people, perhaps where they sourced from. And again, the waves that moved westward into Europe seemed to be, again, that emanation was met with not really encountering any sort of other people that were coming from those places. There was no connection really, like I think like Africa or the Middle East as it much was with the Iranians or with the Dravidians of India and things like that. So that's where it gets a little interesting, to say the least. Please, if you have any more on that one.
So, real simple breakdown. Aryan means noble. It implies emitting nobility or shining with nobility. People nowadays want to pretend that it's not a race, it's a linguistic family. But unfortunately, just like the left today says that race is a social construct, no, society is a racial construct. Way back when, everything that is a culture or a language originated with a certain racially homogenous group of people. This people, the Aryans, spread out over Europe and over large parts of Asia, settling, conquering, taking territory, establishing civilization. And you see that Svan mentioned, at the two furthest extremes of the traditional Aryan migration, you have Ireland and you have Iran. Both of those words in their native tongue mean land of the Aryans. So whereas when they mated with populations in old Europe who were also white people, that maintained a genetic integrity. When the people spread out through Asia and down into India and into the Middle East, that became more and more mixed with the indigenous populations of those areas. But if you look and you see their noble classes or their ruling classes, even to this day, they have much more Caucasian features than the, more lower class people in those societies. And that's a remnant of that ancient heritage. Certainly know by 2023, Europeans and Asians are very different in a lot of ways, but you do find very small pockets of culturally homogenous original Aryans in and around the fringes of what you would consider, where white folks live. And that's that point of differentiation. Now, you'll see, though, that when those became the dominant culture and that language was adopted, even though the genetics changed and the people still speak an Aryan language, they're clearly no longer identifiably of Aryan stock.
Something else worth noting too, Far East in China, the mummies that were found or genetically tested recently too, showing that they were the mummies. And of course, China wasn't always, as it is now, nationally bordered. But these mummies were, they had red hair and light skin, and then they did genetic tests on them, and they were comparable to Europeans.
Mm-hmm.
So thus showing that the sourcing.
They also had plaid clothing that was a European style, and it's one of those when you find isolated mountain communities, you'll see this original stock stayed and mated within a small pool of other people to maintain that genetic integrity, sometimes on purpose and sometimes just due to isolation. Next question is, would you consider yourself as tribalists? No, because it all depends on what that word means to you. I would not ever use that word to describe myself, just because back in the day, and I'd say 10 years ago within Asatru, the differentiation was folkish, universalist, with tribalism being something that they put in the middle. Never really had a real definition, but it was kind of like, we're sort of folkish, but if non-folk want to join and they're our friends, we're okay with that too. And that's certainly not our position. It's not my position. The Asatru Folk Assembly has always been a folkish organization. But if you don't come from that nomenclature, if you weren't involved with Asatru 10 years ago, you could be asking me a completely different question. That word can mean many different things. So if you have a follow-up on something a little bit more to that, but as it regards to the position between folkism and universalism, no, we're absolutely folkish.
And to expand on what you mean by modern too, a lot of things that I've noticed, just kind of keeping my eye out on things about the usage of the word tribal. I know, like, there's been people saying, like, find your tribe, and there's been a push for tribalism as a mindset amongst people that might be inclined towards certain philosophical views of things, like whether it's the corruption of the West, and you got to rely on your people. That tribalism might be where they're coming from as well. I just wanted to bring that up.
If that's the case, if the case is being focused on your local communities of similar people, then absolutely. If the idea of being tribal is focused on people that share your ethnicity, then certainly as a folkish man, I'm absolutely for that. So again, that word is so tricky because it means, it's been used many times over the years to mean many different things. Our next question is, are you guys familiar with the Wendover bog bodies in Florida? Caucasian bodies, red hair, average of 6 foot high, with a bog cemetery. Are you familiar with that, Svan?
Just recently, actually, so it's really cool that this was brought up, because it was like, whoa, yeah. And I was going to talk to you about this because we were talking about the Moon-Eyed people amongst the Cherokee, just north of the Florida Seminole territories, and how they were kind of the Cherokee spoke of the Moon-Eyed people living in that area, and then they kind of like purged them out. And I had often wondered if perhaps, what if there was like some sort of southern migration, or what if their expanse, even there was no migration, it was just the Cherokee were encountering people in that area that they managed to deal with, but they didn't really go any further south into where they were already established down there as well. Yeah, that's interesting. I'm just now starting to look into that. But again, if you look at the Cherokee Moon-Eyed people, that really piqued my interest in how there might be some connectivity between the two. And the fact of the bog burial is, really interesting. The idea of the Atlantic Nordic land bridge. A lot of people have been, talking about that, with understanding that there was like physical land between like Scotland and the mainland, but that there may have also been like physical ice to bridge over, and that there might have been, migration. But if we're talking about bog burials and things like that, that's very interesting, because that would place out that the progression was either genetically the same, like they sourced from the same people that became bog burial style, so that tradition was genetically built in, and they expressed divinity and faith in the same way from where they sourced from, or there was some sort of transatlantic physical movement from that time when that was prevalent to North America in a span of time that we don't fully know or understand. I don't know. Very interesting. I'm just now getting into it.
Yeah, I, very, very recently heard anything about the Windover bodies, but the idea of ancient white folks in the Americas is something that I'm very, very interested in. I've always found fascinating. One thing, I live out here in Reno, and very close to me, a couple hours away, is the Lovelock Caves. And there's, legend about these red-haired giants that lived in the caves, and the local Indian tribes eventually trapped them in their cave and smoked them out and killed them all. But it was really fascinating because they're very much described as Caucasians with red hair.
And then, and they went into those caves and found bones of,
Yeah. Yep.
Yeah.
And again, not freakish giant, but 6 foot and above kind of bone structure. No, absolutely, that's fascinating. I talked last week about talked about bog burials. Well, this was last week. I talked about mound burials. The mounds in West Virginia, and the mound building culture there is so very different than other Native American cultures, yet it's so very similar to the mounds that we saw when we were in Denmark a couple months before I was in that area. So that was also fascinating. There's a lot to uncover there, and it's hard to find definitive things on it, but it's absolutely fascinating. Next question. I understand it's a touchy word, but would you say that the Christianization of at least some parts of Scandinavia was a genocide? What would you say on that, Svan?
I would say no. Mainly because, and again, it's a touchy word, so just bear with me on it. But there was and especially the Christianization, because you brought that up. Christianization was about utilizing the people, the land, and if they were decimated, there was nothing left. I don't think they were. Christianity has so much overlay on and so much seepage up through it. It was trying to cap off the old ways, and so much has come up through it through time that there was not, I would say, an enough of a distinct breakage between the people of the elder faith and the Christianity that was coming from Rome. I think they saw this more as a political and governmental changeover, and that the spiritual part followed later. And that spiritual part had a lot of massive effects. I think spiritually, it killed a lot, but physically, I don't think it fits quite.
So words matter, and I understand that there's a lot of overlap. It's it's like when the lefties want to accuse somebody of being racist against crippled people. Crippled people's not a race. Racism doesn't apply. It was a terrible human rights atrocity, certainly. It was not a genocide because I don't think it was trying to eliminate a certain genetic group. And I think that difference really does matter, and it's why I wouldn't call it that. It's just as bad, just as much of an act of criminality against our people, but it wasn't to replace them genetically. It was very much to alter the political and religious landscape, and through brutal means and through lots of deaths. But there was never the intent to wipe out the Scandinavian people and replace them with continental Europeans. Next
Perhaps,
week, go ahead.
Perhaps the spiritual severance. They desperately sought to kind of dissect the people from the birthright, the blood, the faith of that flows in them.
It was a religio-side, maybe.
Yeah.
But the motivation was not genetic, so I couldn't call it that. God, that is what I wanted to ask. Is there any AFA in East Palestine right now or around it? And are they all right? It is sad that they just cover it up and lie about how dangerous it really is. No, and as a matter of fact, when you asked the question, I checked our map. There is nobody in East Palestine, which is very small. We do have members as close as the Youngstown area, which is still pretty close, but it falls kind of right in the middle between two larger groups of folk who are in, Akron and Pittsburgh. So it falls in kind of an area where we don't have a lot of membership except for the couple of folks in Youngstown. But I'm glad that you mentioned that, and I will reach out to their folk builder and just make double sure that they're all right. So that is the last question we've got in the queue tonight. Does anybody have any last minute things they want to ask or make sure that we get to?
Seeing all these really cool, interesting conversations going on in the chat, I think that's a part I never really contended with, was the entertainment / information and kind of interesting points being made in chat. That's really cool.
Really happy there's so much engagement. The chat on this is always very lively. We got a lot of great people over there that have really, useful. Oh, okay. This is what I did want to touch on. And if you guys ask a question before I'm done with this, we'll absolutely get to it and answer it. And if not, we'll probably call it a night. I saw a question in the chat or some comments about, No, I see this question that popped up. I do not stop eating wrap snacks because they're delicious. I will eat wrap snacks that are gifted to me. It has been a long time since I have purchased wrap snacks, if that makes it any better. I'm grasping at straws. So what I will say is about Hoffs. We had a comment over there like, man, all the Hoffs are in the East. We really need another Hoff in the West. The only Hoff in the West is Odin's Hoff. That's true. And so I thought it would be useful to talk about, maybe why that is or what the criteria is on where we're going to put these Hoffs. Planning wise, we have pretty free reign of where we want to put most of these. The two exceptions to my mind being Njordshof, it was very important to us that we put that someplace that was coastal and that had a, living off of the sea tradition to it. That was really important. We had considered one time Washington State as a possibility or Florida. And, obviously we've gone with White Springs, Florida. And I think it's great there. But that one needed to be near a thriving coastal area. And then Ullershof. When we do Ullershof, it's important to me that it's somewhere that's cold, ideally somewhere that's cold and mountainous, and that, there's hunting and things that take place and snow. I think it would be certainly a wonderful thing to honor Uller in Arizona, but I think having an Uller's Hof in Arizona for his first Hof would be, less than ideal. That said, we've got a pretty wide array of things other than that for most of our Hofs. So it comes down to, where do we have enough people to maintain it and members that would want to go to it? And so we start looking at places within, large clusters of people within about a 2 to 3 hour commute to it. But on top of that, what we've really learned over time is that we need a Gothi in the area to provide the priestly functions of the Hof, but also to provide the stability of being, a time-tested AFA leader in the spot, to run the Hof, to take care of it, to make sure that, it's taken care of properly. A Hof is a big investment. It's a big upfront investment, but more than that, once we establish a Hof, we make a commitment to forever have that be a beautiful, wonderful place and a temple to one of our gods. So we can't have people up and leave and then be stuck with this empty building. That's not our commitment. We owe them better than that. So we try to pick the spots that are going to be most secure and have that redundancy of people there. Now, I don't know if it's unfortunate or not. Perhaps it's unfortunate if you live in the West. But for the AFA, our growth has been great, but very much of that growth has happened in the eastern half of the country lately, which is strange because the AFA started out as such a West Coast phenomenon. Now, we have tons of members out West, don't get me wrong, but providing that structure to get a Hof out there, it is still in competition with some areas in the East. I mentioned when we're looking at where we would like to have Bragishof, some really strong front runners, like I said, are somewhere in the Pacific Northwest, somewhere in Arizona, somewhere in Texas. I think either three of those would be a great choice with the current layout we have now. But we do have areas in like Maine and New Hampshire that are absolutely on the rise. And if they catch up and are in a better, more favorable spot by then, that is another very realistic opportunity. But I just wanted to share what's, some of the ideas that go into it. And then again, something else that goes into it is, all things being equal, which of those places can we find the facility that we need for a price that we can afford that's within our price range? As we become larger and as you guys continue to be so generous, our means and what we can afford expands, but we do got to still make reasonable choices on that. And very often the properties that we would want with the buildings on them we'd want are beyond our grasp economically. So, getting something in Washington State is very hard to do economically, whereas getting something in, another state might be easier. I know that the states that I mentioned, specifically, the Northeast and the Northwest, are very expensive, whereas Texas, you can find some very, very good deals. And in Arizona, you can find some good deals as well. So that does factor in. But there's all these different things that come into play between now and then. And I'll definitely keep you guys updated as our plans develop on that. Got a couple of more questions in here. One question is, superstition is nothing other than paganism surviving within Christianity. Would you say that you agree with that based on this premise that Germanic heathenry never died even after the Christianization? I think that some superstition is certainly paganism holding over through Christianity. And I think that's absolutely true. I think there's other superstition. There's Christian superstition. So I don't think that all superstition is a holdover of pagan belief, but I do think that quite a bit of it is, and is based on pieces of that. And I also do and I don't agree with that premise. I think it's very tempting for us to want to suggest that Asatru never died out as a practice, and there were always these little small underground enclaves of people practicing it, but we don't really see evidence of that. We do see a very long holdover in folk tradition and people hanging on for a very long time, but we don't see 1500s, 1600s practitioners of Asatru. We really don't. I wish that we did. And I believe that a whole lot of elements of it culturally survived. And certainly the seed for it, the fertile ground for it survived in our existence as a people. And as I said towards the beginning of the broadcast, it exists within us, within our folk soul, to reestablish our relationship with our gods. And that wasn't awake and active for a really long time. And I think that it has awakened and become active in the last 100 years, certainly. But yeah, I do think that quite a bit of superstition and certainly a lot of cultural elements and cultural trappings for other religious experience are definitely holdovers from our ancestral faith. What do you think, Svan?
The only thing I would say, just to bear in mind, when superstition is kind of dropped, it means irrational. And I think that there was a big movement in Christianity, even amongst other Christians, was this idea of centralizing the urban versus the agricultural. And so in a sense of like, yes, agricultural cultures kept many of that alive, even despite the integration or encapsulation of Christianity. But it wasn't irrational. I think sometimes things like that too can become more irrational as it gets disconnected from the cultural sense of passing it down. But, again, even the word pagan, utilized before Christianity was seen as a bumpkin or like if a Roman soldier referred to another Roman soldier as a Paganini, he was a person that lived out in the mountains and had a plot of land. And so therefore he might have the old ways about things or the old thoughts of things. And that's interesting even before Christianity in Rome. But I just, the idea of it being irrational, sometimes, yes, because I think there was a cultural disconnect after Christianity came in. Other times too, Christianity itself has created its own various types of superstitions, even based on how Christianity interacted with people, or as urbanization in Rome, the superstitions that kind of came from there might be very different than, say, the agricultural Christians of near Holland or something like that. But yeah, so yes and no.
So Obsidian Skull makes a good point over in the chat, talking about the evidence of sacrifices to elves and saints. And to clarify, you're 100% correct in the sense that those are pagan things to do. Certainly, they're certainly against, the tenets of the Bible and Judaism and Christianity for certain. But my point is, the people who were practicing those, even though some of those saints were modeled after our ancient gods, the people who practiced that didn't conceive of those saints as being, Aesir or the gods of our ancestors. The people who worship them and with sacrifice, who worship them in a pagan and idolatrous manner, still conceived of them in that Christian context as martyrs for Christ or soldiers for Christ. That mindset really was very, very complete for, Central, Western, and Northern Europe, and Southern Europe, certainly. There was areas in like Lithuania that it lasted very much longer. And there was probably still communities in that area that maintained some authentic form of the paganism into modern times. But in medieval times, folks doing very pagan things in their Catholicism still felt they were practicing Catholicism, even though they were doing it in a very unorthodox way. So we've got 2 more questions left. Does the AFA accept people that might not be seen as white, such as how in America, Hispanic is seen as a race, but some of them are also white with Spanish plus other European ancestry? Does the AFA accept them? So we get asked this a lot, and I think it's really important to clarify this so people know and understand, and I do get the question. And the Hispanic ones are an interesting one. So the AFA standard is, always has been, and always will be, do you look white? Do you identify yourself as white? Do other people see you? Do we see you as white? And that's kind of the test. We don't do a DNA test on it. We don't, try to figure that out. If you are, Hispanic in the sense that you come from Mexico or Cuba or one of those places, and you are a Spaniard, and your people have always been Spaniards and are not intermixed significantly with the native population, then you're a Spaniard. A Spaniard is absolutely one of our folk and is white, and we accept that. If when we see you, we don't see a Spaniard, we see an Aztec, then no, we don't accept that. The other thing is, even if we look at you and we see a Spaniard, if you want to tell us all day long about how Aztec you are, then we would also not accept that. The example I use is Elizabeth Warren. She did her genetics. She's whiter than the rest of us. She's as white as you could possibly be. But she's going to go around and talk about how she's an Indian all day long, and that's disruptive to our group, and we don't find that acceptable. So there's not a perfect answer to that question, especially when you talk about Hispanics. If you watch a lot of, Mexican soap operas, a whole lot of those people are white folks. But a lot of them aren't. So it's a very fine line, and it's unfortunate that people find themselves in that spot. But it's about whether you appear to the rest of us to be white, and whether you are convinced that you are white and don't tell us about how not white you are. Last question of the night. I know it's a touchy subject for some, but I'm really curious. to know your opinions of Adolf Hitler. Was he a hero of our race, or was he evil as many claim him to be? So here's the thing. It's not just a touchy subject. It's become the Hitler and the National Socialist German Workers' Party have become the boogeyman of the West for the last, 90 years. It is so complex, and so much of the facts are lost to time, and so much of the facts are hopelessly overshadowed by dishonest history portrayal, that it becomes very, very hard to have any kind of objective or fair conversation about that. As it is right now, I'm speaking for the Asatru Folk Assembly, and as the Asatru Folk Assembly, we have no position on, 1930s and 40s German politics. You will find members of the AFA with all varying degrees on that subject. What I do want to say is, it is a disservice to truth when you allow propaganda to get in the way of accurately recording history. And it is a very big disservice to truth and to future generations when you politicize history and you make it illegal to question history or to look into history with a fair and objective view, or to have an alternative theory about history. And it always makes me very, very curious and very suspicious, because there's not many things in history that you're not allowed to question, yet in large parts of the Western world, things involving that regime and that conflict, you're not allowed to have a question on. So if that is a question you need to resolve in your mind, I would encourage you to look into that and see the people that you're not allowed to question, and see the facts that you're not allowed to dispute, and have that guide some of your quest to better understand that history. And I think that's probably the best we've got on that for right now. Svan, thank you so much for joining us again tonight. Your talks are always fantastic. You drop so much knowledge on all of us. We really appreciate you. I look forward to talking to you again in 2 weeks.
Yeah, thank you for having me. And I did want to give a little hail to Ian. Me and him go really far back, as far as, I guess, social media, just religious conversations that back, about Asatru all the way back in the early teens of the 2000s. So it's kind of nice to see him, say hello. I don't know if he remembers me, because again, it wasn't a physical, but it was online, and we discussed a lot about religion and things like that. And we're in groups talking about different kinds, like a lot of what we're kind of talking about here. So just wanted to say hail.
All right. Well, you guys have a great night. I look forward to talking to y'all again next week. Hail the gods, hail the folk, hail the AFA, and remember that victory never sleeps.